will be in order. Members, please remove your conversation from the House floor. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Members, please remove your conversation from the House floor. What purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Resolution 796, I call up Bill H.R. 1625 with the Senate amendment thereto, and I have a motion at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the bill, designate the Senate amendment, and designate the motion.
H.R. 1625, an act to amend the State Department Basic Authorities Act of 1956 to include severe forms of trafficking in persons within the definition of transnational organized crime for purposes of the rewards program of the Department of State and for other purposes. Senate amendment. Mr. Frelinghuysen moves that the House concur in the Senate amendment to H.R. 1625 with an amendment consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-66.
Pursuant to House Resolution 796, the motions shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Frelinghuysen, and the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Lowy, each will control 30 minutes. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Members, please remove your conversation from the House floor. The House will be in order. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today to present House Amendment to Senate Amendment to H.R. 1625, the final appropriations package for fiscal year 2018. This legislation contains full funding for all of the 12 annual appropriations bills. It represents thousands of hours of work and input by members of Congress and our great staff, starting 1 year ago with 12 appropriations bills moving through the committee process last spring. These bills were then considered and passed onto the House floor under a transparent and inclusive process. This represents the first time the House has passed all 12 bills before the end of the fiscal year since 2010. After the bipartisan budget deal was enacted last month, Appropriations Committee leadership, House and Senate leadership on both sides of the aisle, and the White House quickly went to work, negotiating in good faith and in the best interests of the American people. The bill we're considering today is a product of that hard-fought agreement. In total, the legislation provides $1.3 trillion in discretionary funding for the federal government, including $78.1 billion for the global war on terror and overseas contingency operations. This meets the caps provided in the recent budget agreement. Most importantly, Mr. Chairman, it includes historic investments in our armed forces, including the largest year-to-year increase in funding for the Department of Defense since the beginning of the war on terror. It fully funds a 2.4 pay increase for our servicemen and women, the largest in 8 years, and provides the largest dollar total ever for the Department of Veterans Affairs. In addition to strengthening our national defense, this legislation boosts security here at home, stronger border infrastructure, additional boots on the ground, and better technology and equipment that will close the gaps at our borders. Specifically, this includes more than $1.5 billion for physical barriers and associated technology along the southwest border. Overall, funding for border security and law enforcement is increased by over 30% above last year. Funding is also focused on critical domestic priorities, addressing urgent needs that will improve the quality of life for all Americans and support economic growth and job creation, especially infrastructure, providing more than $21.2 billion in new funding for transportation infrastructure, as well as energy and water infrastructure and technology like broadband and cybersecurity. This package also targets approximately $84 billion to fight the opioid epidemic that is devastating families across the country, the largest investment in addressing this public health issue and emergency to date. Funding is also directed towards school safety, providing the training, mental health services, and grants to community that will help prevent the kind of tragedy and heartbreak that occurred recently in Florida. and it provides robust funding for wildlife firefighting prevention program and includes long-sought forest management and fire budgeting reforms that will provide for budget certainty and improve the health of our forests. All of these investments are made responsibly, implementing strong oversight at every level of government to ensure we get the most out of every dollar. Consequently, Mr. Speaker, I hope that every member supports this package. Before I close, I'd like to acknowledge, Mr. Chairman, the many people who helped bring this bill to the floor. Ms. Lowy, my counterpart, the ranking member, thank you for your support and friendship. To the 12 committee chairs and their ranking members for the hard work that they did over the last 12 months. The Appropriations Committee staff, all true professionals, some behind me, some across the floor, some in the galleries, for putting in countless hours and sleepless nights to help us bring this bill to the floor within a few weeks of the cap deal. In particular, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize our staff team led by our very able staff director, Nancy Fox, assisting her, Maureen Holohan, Stephen Sepp, Shannon O'Keefe, Jennifer Hing, Jason Gray, Marta Hernandez, Tammy Hughes, Rachel Kaler, Parker Van De Water, Tom Delp, and on the minority side, Shalanda Young and Chris Bigelow. Special thanks to our remarkable and amazing clerks, Tom O'Brien, John Martens, Jennifer Miller, Angie DiCarlo, Dina Barron, Donna Shabazz, Dave Lestrang, Susan Ross, Jenny Pannone, Sue Qantas, Craig Higgins, and Doug Disrod. Also, I'd like to recognize the work of Kevin Linsky, Surveys and Investigations, Jim Cahill, and Kathy Little. And I'd also like to recognize those who in our staff who are moving or retiring, Matt Dennis, Chris Romig, and Kara Murphy. And to my own personal staff back in the Rayburn building, ably led by Katie Hazlett. Mr. Speaker, it's time that we fully fund the federal government for fiscal year 2018. Our current continuing resolution expires tomorrow. It's in the best interest of the American people that we get this work done this morning, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
The Omnibus Appropriations Act repudiates the abysmal Trump budget, investing robustly in critical priorities like child care, transportation infrastructure, national security, election protection, medical research, opioid abuse prevention and treatment, veterans' health services, and much more. These investments are key to strong families and communities, job creation, and economic growth. This bill rejects scores of divisive poison pill riders targeting women's health, clean air and water, worker rights, consumer financial protections, health insurance, and other critical priorities. In addition, I'm pleased the omnibus includes language clarifying that the CDC has the authority to conduct research on the causes of gun violence. Within the State and Foreign Operations Division, this omnibus invests in stronger and more stable communities around the world, alleviating poverty and disease, and strengthening democratic political systems. These investments in diplomacy and development are critical to our national security. I'm pleased this final product rejects onerous policy riders like the global gag rule. These responsible investments and policies signal to the world that despite an erratic president, the United States remains a world leader. To be clear, this omnibus is not a perfect product. I strongly object to the majority's fixation on walling off our southern border and building capacity to arrest and detain immigrants. While the bill rejects the administration demands for a border wall, a large deportation force, and more detention beds, the amount provided is nonetheless a waste of money and contrary to our national character. Before I conclude, I would like to thank Chairman Frelinghuysen for his partnership and all the members of the committee for your contributions. I would also like to thank the minority, majority, and personal office staffs who worked so very hard, particularly Shalonda Young and Chris Bigelow and Richard Meltzer. I also want to thank the committee's minorities, outstanding communication director Matt Dennis, who is departing the House next month. He has served this institution for nearly 15 years at the Appropriations Committee, in my personal office, and in former Congressman Rush Holt's office. And we will really miss his dedicated service. I want to make sure I thank the minority staff, Nancy Fox and her team, because there was real cooperation between the majority and the minority, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from New York reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the Chairman of the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee, Mr. Rogers from Kentucky.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the chairman for yielding, and despite his laudable efforts to complete all 18 fiscal year 18 House bills on time, the perpetual stalemate on unrelated matters left us with this undesirable choice of several continuing resolutions. Piecemeal funding of government is universally harmful, but now we've a chance to get back on track and finalize funding for fiscal 18. Mr. Speaker, there's a reason why we have a rule against legislating on appropriations bills. And yet here we are. The only holdback that kept us from getting these bills done on time was the fact that a lot of people, some even in leadership, who wants to load on to this must-pass bill legislation that's controversial. And yet our committee has to cope with an unsatisfactory arrangement. Protecting American interests around the globe through military readiness and diplomacy is not a luxury in this hostile environment. It's a responsibility. This bill provides the necessary resources to fulfill that responsibility. It upholds our commitments to key strategic partners and allies such as Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Ukraine. The bill also will assist other partners to fight terrorism, secure borders, resist aggression, and stabilize communities affected by conflict. We also uphold our long-standing commitment as Americans to help those displaced by conflict or natural disaster or facing famine. Today's bill will also fight back against the scourge of opioid abuse and help reignite the economy of coal country. Like Operation Unite in my Kentucky district, the federal government has taken a holistic approach to tackle the complex opioid problem. The agreement provides historic levels of funding for law enforcement, treatment, prevention, recovery, and research. Only when these elements all work in concert will we truly be able to turn the tide and save lives. In addition, after struggling under the war on coal, it's time to turn a new page in Central Appalachia. This bill will give us more tools to strengthen economic development in that region. First, the agreement invests in cutting-edge technologies to ensure coal remains a significant part of our energy portfolio, both here at home and abroad. There's also continued support for the Abandoned Mine Lands pilot program that allows, with the gentleman yield.
Yield gentleman another 15 seconds.
Gentleman recognized for 15 seconds.
Thank you.
This support for the AML pilot program allows us to clean up abandoned mines and repurpose them to create jobs. Finally, I'm proud that this agreement includes legislation that I helped introduce, the Stop School Violence Act, which aims to curb the epidemic of violence in our schools. This is a significant step forward in our effort to protect our children from senseless tragedy. And, Mr. Speaker, I urge a vote yes.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Ohio, the ranking member of the Energy and Water Subcommittee, Ms. Kaptur.
Gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the ranking member for yielding me time and for her incredible work on this bill, and also to the chairman of the full committee, Congressman Frelinghuysen. I rise in support of this bipartisan agreement before us and want to thank again Chairman Frelinghuysen and Ranking Member Lowy and our able committee staff on both sides for their tireless effort to slog this across the finish line after 5 false starts. It is utterly ridiculous that nearly halfway into the fiscal year that began last October 2017, we finally arrived at the brink of completion of our top priority, funding the operations of the government of the United States from the Defense Department to children's health. Republicans control both chambers of Congress as well as the White House, yet the delays and dysfunction have been worse than ever. Americans around our country can't extend deadline after deadline after deadline after deadline after deadline in their jobs. We should live up to those same standards. In my title, the Energy and Water Development Bill, we make progress by bringing forward America's backlog construction projects, which number into the billions of dollars, making many important investments for our nation's infrastructure, including a 13% increase for the Army Corps of Engineers over 2017, which will allow for more critical waterways projects to drive our economy and job creation, an 11% increase to the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy to finally move toward complete energy independence for our country, including through the weatherization program, which has increased, as well as an additional 15% to invent our energy future through our most advanced energy technology programs, ARPA-E. Additionally, we removed a harmful rider on the waters of the U.S. rule, which along with others would have seriously hindered overall passage. The deal busts through budget caps set in 2011 by $143 billion, or 13%. And although I support investment in our military, the balance between defense and our domestic priorities is skewed in the wrong direction. In Ohio, we're at the epicenter of the opioid epidemic with more than 5,000 drug-estimated overdose deaths in the last 12 months alone. We rank second in the nation for deaths per capita. Might I ask for an additional 45 seconds?
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 additional minute.
Thank you. Although I support the inclusion of a $2.7 billion increase for opioid prevention, treatment, and recovery, this funding only nibbles at the edge of the problem. This is a national crisis. It must be reflected in a real plan to meet the crisis, including funding priorities. No matter how many fighters or tanks we have, America will not be strong abroad if vast segments of our own population are dying here at home. More than in traffic accidents, more from major diseases, from opioid and drug overuse. This bill is a fair compromise, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes, despite some of the major provisions that are not in there that break our hearts. The American people are counting on us to run our nation's ship of state. Let's do that today. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Ohio yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and exclude extraneous material on the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 1625, and that I may include tabular material on the same.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, pleased to yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Agricultural Subcommittee, Mr. Adderholt of Alabama.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to echo a few of the comments you've already heard this morning. The Appropriations Subcommittees have indeed spent many months and countless hours in developing a bill that really and truly invests in our critical national needs. And that's from defense to rural infrastructure to major health crises such as opioids. As chairman of the Agricultural Subcommittee on Appropriations, let me add that this division of the bill has solid wins for agriculture, for the food sector, the healthcare community, and for rural America. Members from rural districts with agricultural constituents, like I have down in Alabama, can be proud of the many accomplishments that are included in this bill. We're restoring funding and greatly adding to the needed infrastructure upgrades. This bill also provides necessary relief for American farmers and ranchers who continue to experience a significant reduction in income over the past few years. This bill today contains a down payment on ensuring that rural America is not left behind. The Rural Development Account in this bill today contains $625 million of commitment to expanding rural broadband in an effort to close the rural divide for 23 million Americans. That's about 40% that do not have access to rural broadband. In addition to broadband, the bill invests in water and water waste needs for rural constituents. The bill provides a total of $3 billion in loan authorizations and $1 billion in grants, an increase of $500 million over the last year to provide for clean and reliable water resources in rural America. In closing, it is my hope that as we move forward in the appropriations process, there's been a lot of, as been said here this morning, a lot of concerns of how we've moved forward with this process and a lot of extenuous matters that have been added to the bill. But it's my hope that we can take a different approach to the bill in the preparing months as we look forward to the new fiscal year. But this is a process that we have today. The simple fact remains that we have to fund the federal government. We have to do it, and we have to do it today. So in closing, I ask my colleagues to support this bill as we rebuild America's defenses and provide vital health and safety needs to all Americans.
Third gentleman from reserves, gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, the ranking member of Labor HHA Subcommittee, Ms. DeLauro.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the Omnibus Funding Bill for 2018 makes important investments in health, education, and job programs. It rejects many of the damaging ideological riders that marked earlier efforts in this appropriations process. And in a time when the Trump administration is seeking massive cuts in funding, senseless eliminations of critical programs, and the fundamental hollowing out of our federal agencies, we fought. We fought to include critical investments in democratic priorities that boost the middle class. For health, it's an increase of $3 billion for the National Institutes of Health Research, including an increase of more than 50% to develop a universal flu vaccine. There's an increase of more than $3 billion for opioids, including funding to support treatment and prevention, prescription drug monitoring programs, behavioral health workforce training programs, and so much more. We secured increases for our country's youngest children and their families, including an historic increase of $2.4 billion for child care, $610 million for Head Start. In education, we include public school education formula grants that help students learn and keep them safe, including Title I. Student support and academic enrichment, after school, and special education. We do not advance the radical agenda of taking money from public schools through private school vouchers. And I am thrilled that we have helped to make college more affordable by increasing the maximum Pell Grant and other campus-based financial aid. We achieved an important victory for workers. The deal prohibits employers from pocketing workers' tips, including taking tips to pay managers and supervisors. And workers will have the right to sue to get back their stolen tips, regardless of whether they were paid the full minimum wage or not. We held the line. We kept out the poison pill riders that would harm women's access to health care, riders that negatively impact the Department of Labor's ability to protect workers. This omnibus ignores short-sighted cuts that are proposed by the Trump administration and instead increases funding for priorities that touch people's lives. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Connecticut yields back the balance of her time. The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Defense Subcommittee, Ms. Granger from Texas.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, Congress's #1 responsibility is to provide for the defense of this nation, and this agreement enables us to fulfill the most fundamental constitutional duty. This bill reflects the needs of our defense and intelligence experts so they have the resources needed to combat the threats of today and in the future. In order to do this, this bill focuses on readiness, modernization, and innovation. While these funds, our military can begin to rebuild after 16 years of war. The needs are great. We also include a 2.4% pay raise authorized for our troops with our appreciation for what they do. For procurement, the bill increases investment in ground vehicles, aircraft, ships, munitions, and other equipment. Secretary Mattis has said he never wants our enemies to face a fair fight, and this bill ensures our enemies will face a strong and ready U.S. military. It makes investments in vital aircraft, including Joint Strike Fighters, Super Hornets, Apache, Chinooks, Lakotas, V-22 Osprey, Black Hawks, and C-130s. For the Navy, it funds 14 Navy ships, including 1 carrier replacement, 3 littoral combat ships, 2 guided missiles destroyers, 2 attack submarines, and funding to continue the Ohio replacement submarine program. The National Guard is critical to our national security, and this agreement provides 6 C-130 aircraft, 20 Black Hawk helicopters, and funding for the Army National Guard for support of the southwest border. Additional funding for Army National Guard cyber protection teams, and $1.3 billion for the National Guard and Reserve equipment account. Our military must be ready for future threats. The Department of Defense must look 5, 10, and 20 years ahead to make sure we have the weapon systems we need. That's why this agreement also prioritizes research and development, including next-generation space systems and future ballistic missile defense programs. Last, after talking with Secretary Mattis, we included new flexibility for DoD to ensure that funds were able to be spent in the smartest way possible while still maintaining stringent congressional oversight. I yield back my time.
From Texas yields back her time. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, the ranking member of the Interior Subcommittee, Ms. McCollum.
Gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today in strong support of the Omnibus Appropriations Act. While this is not the bill I would have written, nonetheless it's a significant victory for Minnesotans and Americans. By investing in critical priorities like education, election integrity, housing, infrastructure, public safety, opioid abuse prevention and treatment, veterans' health care, this legislation keeps Minnesota and our entire country safe, strong, and moving forward. As ranking member of the Interior Subcommittee, my focus has been on protecting the environment, upholding our commitments to Native Americans, and preserving our natural resources and cultural treasures. We added new resources to address the maintenance and backlog at our national parks, to support the Smithsonian Institution, and increase funding for the National Endowment for Arts and Humanities. Importantly, we have removed many Republican writers that attacked endangered species, undermined environmental safeguards, and jeopardized public health. In addition, this bill ensures that the federal government will treat wildfires as the natural disasters they are, and stop the ridiculous practice of forcing the Forest Service and the Department of Interior to borrow from other priorities to pay for wildfire suppression. I appreciate the hard work of all my colleagues, but especially Mr. Simpson, in forging this bipartisan compromise. Mr. Speaker, the omnibus represents a major accomplishment on behalf of the American people. I thank Ranking Member Lowy, I thank Chairman Frieslingshauser and Chairman Calvert and all of our staff, both Democratic and Republican, for their hard work on this legislation. I urge my colleagues in joining me in voting for this bipartisan bill. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Minnesota yields back the balance of her time. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is
Mr. Chairman, I'm
recognized.
pleased to yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee, Mr. Simpson of Idaho.
Gentleman from Idaho is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to first thank my ranking member, Marcia Kaptur, for her efforts and input as we've worked through this bill over the past year and developed and completed the final fiscal year 2018 Energy and Water Appropriation Bill. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of our Senate partners, Lamar Alexander and Dianne Feinstein. I rise today in support of the fiscal year 2018 Omnibus Appropriation Bill. It was negotiated in a bipartisan manner, but the end result has a strong emphasis on Republican priorities. Within the Energy and Water Division specifically, those priorities include national security and infrastructure. Funding for DOE's nuclear weapons security program is at $14.7 billion, an increase of $1.7 billion above last year and $738 million above the budget request. These funds will ensure the reliability and effectiveness of our nuclear weapons stockpile and will address a backlog of deferred maintenance at aging nuclear weapons facilities. The bill makes targeted investments to protect our nation's energy infrastructure against cyber and other attacks, including an increase of $18 million above last year's level for research and development activities to strengthen the security of our electrical grid. In total, the Energy and Water Bill increased funding for energy and water resources infrastructure by $1.5 billion above fiscal year 2017. That includes an increase of almost $800 million for the Army Corps of Engineers to address pressing needs at our ports and waterways and to increase public safety through flood and storm damage reduction activities. The bill exceeds the annual Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund activities by providing $1.4 billion. That represents 94% of the estimated annual revenues compared to the awarded 2014 target of 74%. The Bureau of Reclamation is funded at $1.47 billion, including $134 million for water storage projects authorized under the WIN Act, $55 million for additional water conservation and delivery projects, and $66.5 million above the budget request for rural water projects. The bill provides strong support for basic science research with total funding of $6.26 billion for the Department of Energy's Office of Science, an increase of $868 million above last year. Nuclear energy and fossil energy are also increased above last year and with $188 million and $59 million respectively.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional 15 seconds.
The research and development activities will advance the nation's goal of an all or above energy solution, and I encourage my colleagues to support this. I'd also like to take just a second to thank my colleague, Chairman Calvert, for his work on the wildfire funding fix, a bill that I've been working on since 2013 and which Congressman Schrader and I have introduced for the last 3 years. And the Interior Committee and their staff have done a fantastic job of getting in there. This is very important to the West. I urge my colleagues to support this bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. Lee.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank our ranking member for yielding, but also for your tireless work day and night to really help shape this bill to be in many ways a bipartisan bill. Also to all of our ranking members, the input that they received from all of us and our staff, the phenomenal work that they have done has just been amazing in spite of the circumstances. So I just have to thank them and Leader Pelosi for all of their very diligent work. Almost 6 months after the deadline, though, for the fiscal year 2018 appropriations bill, this 2,232-page omnibus was released late last night. Now, less than 24 hours later, we are about to vote on a bill that really no one has had time to read. I don't know who in this body has read this bill. We would have had to read 100 pages per hour to get through this bill. Anybody here read that fast, 100 pages per hour? What kind of informed decisions are we making with this last-minute rush for a vote? This is no way, Mr. Speaker, to run a government. However, yes, this omnibus has some really good provisions in it. It eliminates hundreds of poison riders, ranging from efforts to defund Planned Parenthood to dismantling of critical labor and consumer protections, and thank you very much for that. Many good provisions include a new competitive grant, which we've been working on for years, for computer science funding for young girls and people of color. We include increases in job training, education, and family relief, as well as for historically black colleges and universities. And my state is the highest state with students coming to HBCUs, so thank you again for those increases. Even with these increases, Mr. Speaker, the omnibus bill still falls so far short of what we need to just return to the funding levels before the sequester 8 years ago. Adjusted for inflation, we are still way below the 2010 levels for domestic spending. And what's worse, while underfunding our needs here at home, this bill includes an increase in $80 billion in defense. This includes the Overseas Contingency Fund, which really is a slush fund for the Pentagon to fund these wars off budget. We know that the Pentagon doesn't need this excessive funding and this increase in funding to ensure our national security. A Washington Post report in 2016 exposed the fact that the Pentagon is spending and has spent $125 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse. May I have another minute, please?
For one additional minute. Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. The Pentagon report, $125 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse, yet we're increasing this by $80 billion. Not to mention, much of this funding is dedicated to continuing the endless wars that we're waging around the world, wars that I might add that Congress still has not debated or voted on or authorized. Put simply, the defense spending this year will be the single largest increase for the Pentagon since the beginning of the Bush so-called war on terror. What's worse, this bill also fails to protect our young dreamers who are still stuck in limbo. DACA recipients are American in every way except on paper. When are we going to vote to protect our young people, Mr. Speaker? It's time to put politics aside and pass a Clean Dream Act immediately. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from California yields back the balance of her time. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the Commerce, Justice, and Science Committee, Mr. Culbertson of Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of this critical appropriations bill to ensure that our military has the resources they need to protect us abroad and that our law enforcement agencies have the resources they need to protect us here at home. This legislation makes sure that the U.S. attorneys, the DEA, the ATF, the Marshal Service, and the FBI are getting the money that they need to make our communities safer by investigating and prosecuting more gun and immigration criminals, human traffickers, dealers in opioids and other dangerous drugs, international criminal organizations, and gangs. This bill will make this nation safer and help secure our borders. This bill will also provide funds for over 100 additional immigration judge teams to speed up the removal of people who are in the country illegally. The bill provides new resources for state and local law enforcement, Mr. Chairman, including a $300 million increase in grants to help address the terrible opioid epidemic in this country, and increases to help protect women against violence, to help protect our schools and ensure the safety of our children, to help relieve the backlog of sexual assault kits, and to help fight human trafficking, and to help compensate states for housing illegal aliens in their prisons and jails. The American space program is the best on Earth, and this legislation ensures that it will continue to be the best on Earth, with funding for our human and planetary space program. We have, in fact, the journal Science today reports that this legislation has given a major boost to science across the board. We've made sure the National Science Foundation preserves its competitive edge with a $300 million increase for research grants. These funds will foster innovation and U.S. economic competitiveness, including funding for research on advanced manufacturing, physics, mathematics, cybersecurity, and neuroscience. Mr. Chairman, this bill deserves the support of all members, and I urge a yes vote. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cuellar.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. And I want to thank the ranking member, Ms. Lori, for her leadership, along with Chairman Freeland-Heiser, for many months of working together in a bipartisan way. And I certainly want to thank both of them for the hard work that they've done. I want to thank the appropriators, the Democrats and Republicans working together. And certainly I want to thank the committee staff on both sides that have worked so hard to make sure we get this bill together. I know this is not a perfect bill, but again, we got together, we negotiated, and this is the bill that we got under the system working together. This bill, first of all, funds our military and our veterans' needs. This bill provides over $21.2 billion of infrastructure projects across the nation. This bill addresses the opioid epidemic and also funds, it puts increases for the National Drug Control Policy and other programs to make sure that we fight the drug issues that we have. It adds extra money for the COPS program, which is important for our men and women in blue. It adds 100 new immigration judges to address the issue of the backlog for the immigration cases that we have. It adds 10% of new monies for the community block grants, which is, again, very important to all communities, urban and rural areas. It starts to address the issue of school safety and gun violence by providing the funds to provide funds for safety programs. And it also includes the Fix NICS Act program, which is something that my friend John Covelson and Senator John Cornyn worked on for a long time. It also provides $1.6 billion for community health centers to provide health care. It also provides money for the Pell Grants to make sure that people are able to go to college. And I want to thank my good friend Tom Cole and Rosa DeLauro for putting those dollars in for the Pell Grants. It also provides technology for border security and for ports of entry. And again, we want to make sure we provide a balanced approach for border security. Again, members, I know this bill is not perfect, and if we're waiting for perfection, we're never going to get there. But again, we were able to sit down, we were able to negotiate, and we were able to get a good bill that provides a lot of the basic services that we have. As members of Congress, we have a responsibility, and that responsibility is to make sure that our government stays open. I've always said that terrorists are not able to close our government, but somehow Congress finds a way to close our government. We're not going to do that, and I urge members to support this appropriation bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the Homeland Subcommittee, Judge John Carter from Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this legislation. The Homeland Security Division of this bill contains $47.7 billion to fund the Department of Homeland Security. This bill provides strong funding to help Americans recover from when disaster hits, ensure the security of our air, land, and sea borders, and protect our local communities from outside threats. This bill provides more than 90 miles of barrier fencing to include 33 miles of new fencing in the Rio Grande Valley. It includes $284 million for inspection equipment to combat drug trafficking, to include $71 million to specifically target opioid detection. It contains ICE detention activities and provides additional funding to hire more agents. It funds the vessels and aircraft our Coast Guard needs to protect our coastline, and fully funds the activities to combat cyber attacks. Mr. Speaker, this last year has been a tough year for Texas. We suffered from our most ruthless hurricane season, and I saw the devastation firsthand. This bill will go a long way to help those folks in their homes. This bill includes $7.9 billion for FEMA to continue to respond to this and future disasters, and $249 million of grants to prevent future storms from causing damage like this again. I'd like to thank very much my colleague, Ms. Lucille Robert-Lallard. She's a ranking member on my committee, and she's a dream to work with, and we are great partners in this process. I also like to thank the majority and minority staffs for the hard work on the bill. Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I would like to take a moment to say farewell and thanks to a member of our Homeland team. Christopher Romig is leaving our committee at the end of April after 30 years of service to our nation. He spent 27 of those years in our great Army as a helicopter pilot and leader. He brought his military background to our Homeland team, and we benefited from his experience and sharp mind for the past 3 years. And now we wish him well in his next adventure. I also would like to take just 1 minute to thank the FBI and the ATF for the great work they've done in the Central Texas area for the person that we call the Austin bomber. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the Chairman of the Interior Subcommittee, Mr. Calvert from California.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the 2018 Consolidated Appropriations Act. This agreement continues the subcommittee's critical work addressing wildland fire, domestic energy production, the needs of our national parks. It makes significant investments in health care, law enforcement, educational programs, honoring our long-standing commitments to American Indians and Alaskan Natives. The agreement includes a package of significant forest management and fire budgeting reforms that will provide budget certainty for Forest Service programs and activities, reduce litigation, and most importantly, improve the health of our national forests. This is an accumulation of years-long effort to improve the way we budget for wildland fire and the way our national forests are managed. I want to congratulate Mike Simpson for his leadership on the issue. This agreement provides additional monies to the National Park Service, including an increase of $185 million to address deferred maintenance and construction needs. Payment in lieu of taxes, PILT, is fully funded. And this legislation makes sizable investments in water infrastructure, providing $2.9 billion through the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund, as well as $63 million for WIFIA programs, which will finance over $6 billion in infrastructure programs. Before I close, I want to thank our ranking member, Betty McCollum of Minnesota. She's been a partner and friend as we worked through our hearings, wrote the bill, and moved it through the legislative process. I want to thank Chairman Frelinghuysen for his support of the Interior Subcommittee, his leadership of the committee. Congratulations to you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this bill and this process to a successful conclusion. And finally, I would like to thank the staff who worked so hard on this bill, Darren Benjamin, Betsy Bina, Jackie Kilroy, Kristen Richmond, Dave Lestrang, on my own staff, Ian Foley, Rebecca Cately, Trish Evans, and Dave Kennett in my office. I also want to thank the leadership staff, especially Kyle Weaver in the Speaker's office for their hard work. I certainly urge an aye vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the distinguished Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 4 minutes.
Not a single person has read this bill. It was filed at 8 o'clock last night. If we had put this on the floor, not a single one of you on that side of the aisle would vote for it. Not one. You have demagogued for years about reading the bills. This doesn't come close to your 3-day layover rule. Not close. It is being rushed through because some have fundraisers perhaps this weekend, or have flights or Codels they want to go on. And because we have wasted 6 months passing the appropriation bills, which were supposedly should be passed by September 30th of last year. No one can be proud of this process. The Speaker said when we set the caps that he would bring a bill to the floor. He promised the 73 of us that made it possible to set these caps, because you didn't have the votes on your side. He promised that he would bring to this floor a fix for the dreamers who are at risk of being kicked out of the country. I know there's a case, but it's short term, not permanent. But the Speaker did not keep that promise. It has not been on the floor. What we now have on the floor is an appropriation bill. I think most of us know what's in this appropriation bill. These are earmarks. You don't call them earmarks. You call them authorizing language. They're bills that nobody in the Appropriations Committee has read. And if you have, stand up and correct me. As I said, nobody's read that either. This is report language. Come to the well if you've read this language. None of you would support this process if we had offered it. Now, the good news is that what the Appropriations Committee has done is quality work. And I congratulate Ms. Lowy and Mr. Frelinghuysen and the subcommittee chairs and the ranking members. It is worthy of support. But I'm waiting for all the Tea Parties, people who harangue me and others on my side about reading the bills, giving us sufficient time to consider them. The Speaker of the House said when he became Speaker, we will take issues one at a time. Is there no shame? Is there no realization of the hypocrisy that is being displayed? Mr. Speaker, the product is a good one. And I say that about the appropriation bill. I have no idea all the report language says, and I certainly don't have all idea.
Gentleman is recognized for one additional minute.
I thank the Speaker and I thank Ms. Lowy. We brought this country from the brink of depression to a growing, robust economy with a stock market that has almost tripled by passing the National Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Not a single Republican voted for that, Mr. Speaker. Not one. I wonder how many will vote for this bill after they've said time after time after time after time. Read the bill. Have 3 days layover. Now, actually, your 3-day rule is a 24-hour and 2-second rule. The last second of the first day, 24 hours of the second day, and the first second of the third day. You put everybody in a quandary because this is a good product that the Appropriations Committee has delivered. It does good things for our country, both in terms of national security and in terms of domestic investment. What a sad state of affairs. How dysfunctional this body has become. How marginalized has the Appropriations Committee, on which I was so proud to serve, has become. Rushing it through in just a matter of minutes. It's a sad day, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the Labor, Health and Human Services Subcommittee, Mr. Cole of Oklahoma.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my good friend, the Chairman, for yielding. And I'll have a formal statement I want to submit for the record, but I want to begin by praising Chairman Frelinghuysen, Ranking Member Nita Lowy, the staff, my negotiating counterpart, and wonderful Ranking Member, Ms. Delora. It's been a collaborative effort, and it's one that you can be extraordinarily proud of in terms of having gotten all our bills done on time and presented and across this floor, having worked on a pretty short time frame when the Senate finally came to the ability to negotiate. We were waiting about 180 days for that. They finally got there, and in 4 weeks you got the work done, and it's an exceptional product. From a Republican standpoint, the big win is defense. I know we all want to defend the country, but that was probably the top Republican priority in the bill.
and we more than met our obligation in that respect. I want to focus in the little time I have left on some things I'm particularly proud of in the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education portion of this legislation. $3 billion increase in the National Institute of Health. That's the largest increase in 20 years. $3 billion for opioids, a common problem in all our districts, something that we all care about. $3 billion, roughly in round numbers, for early childhood education and early childhood care. Again, dollars well spent. Major increase in mental health money, actually beginning to match appropriations with some of the authorization done in the 21st Century Cures, one of the great achievements of the last Congress. Tremendous increase in money for school safety grants from $400 million to $1.1 billion. The Pell increase, which has been referred to by several people. More money for career tech and technical education. More money for apprenticeships. All things that will create a more productive economy. So we can go on, but the reality is, in a very difficult time, in a very partisan era, we'll have members from both sides of the aisle passing an important piece of legislation, and the administration, which has urged its passing, doing the same. So I urge the passage and yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, the Democratic leader, Ms. Pelosi.
Gentlewoman from California, the Democratic leader, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank our distinguished ranking member of the Appropriations Committee for yielding this time, but more importantly for exceptional leadership. To her and to the other members of the committee, Mr. Frelinghuysen, thank you for your leadership as well, and to the ranking members, the chairs and ranking members of the subcommittee, all the members of the Appropriations Committee. Mr. Hoyer and I are and Mr. Clyburn are from the culture of the Appropriations Committee, and we know that left to your own devices, the appropriators can get the job done. It's not until the leadership rains its poison pills on the process that the delay sets in. And I want to thank Congresswoman Ranking Member Lowy for ridding this bill of so many of those poison pills. Mr. Hoyer very eloquently presented the situation as we see it now, that the Republicans have this bill. We didn't even have 3 days. It was last night to today. And here we are on the floor with this, a yard of bill. And he said they're rushing because people have Codels and trips and fundraisers and this and that. I contend there may be another reason why they're rushing it through. First of all, they don't want anybody to know what's in the bill, because this is a tremendous victory for the American people in terms of what Ms. Lowy was able to negotiate in a bipartisan way on the domestic side. We all take an oath to protect and defend our country, and so the defense investments are important to our nation. But 1/3 of the domestic budget is security, Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, the State Department, anti-terrorism activities of the Justice Department, the list goes on. But it is also a fact that we can measure our strength of our country not only in the important military might and security measures, but also in the health, education, and well-being of the American people, and this bill goes to a place for that. So, yes, a yard of bill, certainly not read or read to the members. But I contend, in addition to Mr. Hoyer's list of why people they're rushing this to the end instead of having this negotiation take place much earlier, is because they really don't want their members to see what is in this bill, A, and two, because they really want to get out of town before the March for Our Lives, before the young people come from all over the country to ask Congress to give us responsible, common sense gun violence prevention legislation. That's what I heard about the Republicans. They just don't want to be around when those young people come to town. And so here we are. We could have had this happen weeks ago and had a much more transparent way to deal with it. But having said that, we are here, and I think it's very important to set the record straight on some of the contentions that the Republicans are making about this bill. Let me start with the President of the United States. He has said in one of his tweets this morning how happy he was because he got the $1.6 billion to start the wall and more to come. That's not completely true, Mr. President. There's some resources for fencing and repairs and the rest there, but some of that money is for technology and other ways to protect our borders. We all have a responsibility to protect our borders, north and south. But if you want to think that you're getting a wall, you just think it and sign the bill. In addition, he said he's so pleased that he got this big increase in defense. We did not oppose that. We want to have our men and women in uniform have everything they need to keep our country safe and themselves safe. But the President went on to say, it's too bad he had to waste money on the Democratic giveaways. On the Democratic giveaways. Democratic giveaway is the way the President characterizes funding for our heroic veterans facing a dire shortfall at the VA. And we say on the battlefield, no soldier is left behind. When they come home, no veteran is left behind. And that was part of the fight we had in the CAPS fight, that we wanted additional money for our veterans. What about fighting the opioid epidemic? Is that wasteful? What a giveaway? Fighting the opioid epidemic in your district? There isn't a person serves in this Congress who doesn't have need in their districts for this opioid funding. And that was a major part of our fight on the CAPS, was to get the funding for to fight opioids. But the President calls that a waste, a Democratic giveaway. Was that what he would call, he probably would call, protecting the integrity of American elections from Russian meddling and attack, Democratic giveaways, protecting our democracy, our electoral system, our Constitution that we take an oath of office to protect and defend? And how about for hardworking parents who struggle to succeed and afford quality child care? Very important part of this legislation. Democratic giveaway? No. Family values, supporting our families. So the list goes on and on. And by the way, by the foot. By the foot. Mr. Hoyer referenced a statement made by the Speaker on the floor of the House when we had the CAPS fight, which, by the way, was a glorious victory for our values as a country, that we could say, yes, we want to increase funding for our national security, and in doing that, we need to have a commensurate increase in funding for our domestic agenda, as I said, which contains many security measures. But when that bill was brought to the floor, the Speaker came to the floor and he made a statement right here in the well. Well, Steny quoted what he said in the well, but in another venue he said, in order to shift our focus and get on to the next big priority, which is a DACA solution, we've got to get this budget agreement done. That was the CAPS bill. And I'll say it once, Mr. Speaker said, and I'll say it again, we will bring a DACA solution to the floor. Yes. And when will that be? Now, you'll hear rumors of them saying, oh, we offered this and we offered that. They did not offer anything that added to the protection of our dreamers and our DACA qualified children. So I want the record to show the facts are these. We proposed over and over again a real fix that we should have in this bill because it's timely. And if you're dealing with a yard of issues and provisions, you certainly can have room for protecting our dreamers. And that's just an indication. Look, to lead is to take risks. The Speaker does not seem willing to take a risk with his caucus to bring to a bill to the floor. Well, you would say any bill you want in terms of including some bipartisan bills, Mr. Hurd and Mr. Aguilar, Ms. Ross-Layton and Ms. Roy Allard, and any other bill you want. Make it Queen of the Hill. Let everyone have his or her say. Let Congress work its will. Why? Why not? And why, in light of this statement, I'll say it once and I'll say it again, we will bring a DACA solution to the floor. When might that be? When might that be? So again, it's, while we address so many issues, so many provisions in this bill, wasn't there room in the hearts and minds of our Republican colleagues to insist, because I know many of you care about our dreamers, have publicly offered your support, why can't you convince the Speaker to bring what he said, we will bring a DACA solution to the floor? So again, I go back to the CAPS agreement. It was a great victory for us in the appropriations world as to what priorities need to be addressed. As we always say, the budget should be a statement of our national values. What's important to us as a nation should be reflected in how we allocate our resources to invest in the security of our country, the well-being of our people, the future of our children, and to do so in a way that commands respect, that is bipartisan, that is done in a transparent way, in an open and transparent way, and brings unity. Our founders, they were so brilliant in so many ways. It would take me 8 hours to even start to talk about how brilliant they were. But they did give us instruction. They gave us a signal. E pluribus unum, from many one. From many one. They couldn't possibly have imagined how many we would be or how different we would be. But they knew we had to be one. And these children and everyone in our country, these dreamers, are part of that one, and they're part of that many. And let us treat our country with the honoring the vows of our founders. So I leave it up to members as to whether they want to vote or weigh the equities in this bill and take a vote and respect whatever decision they make. But I'm so glad that we had such an overwhelming vote on our side against a rule that undermines the regular order of the House, undermines the Speaker's own statements about that regular order. Why? In an attempt to keep from all of you how much investment in the future is in this bill, and also to get you out of town before the March for Our Lives begins. That's why I think we're doing this so rushed. I don't know why it has been pushed to the end, except for dysfunction on the part of the Republican leadership and the whatever, if it's called communication, with the White House. But I will say this, that this is 5 CRs. Are you proud of that? 5 CRs. Take us to the floor with a yard-high bill. No transparency, but it does have some bipartisanship, and for that I salute Mr. Frelinghuysen and Congresswoman Lowy and respect whatever decisions our members make on this. This is a missed opportunity to show the American people that even when we're on the right course, we can't seem to get there in a transparent way. I say, Mr. President, when you sign this bill, you will be signing something, in spite of what you say about spending on wasteful Democratic funding. I don't really think you mean that about opioids and the rest. Set the record straight for yourself, and out of respect for the people who are pinning their hopes on what this legislation will do for them. I thank and yield back my time.
Gentlewoman from California yields back the balance of our time. Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair and not to perceived audience or other members. The gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I please yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee, Mr. Diaz-Balart of Florida.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Today we will vote on a bill that rebuilds our military, it supports our troops, and protects the American people. And major credit for this great achievement goes to the man that I am so proud to call my chairman, Rodney Frelinghuysen. You know that Chairman Frelinghuysen has been a public servant since the days that he served in Vietnam as an enlisted soldier. And that service continues to this day with this bill, which includes the most significant support for our women and men in uniform since the beginning of the war on terrorism. And let me tell you two other things that are in this bill for the American people due to the chairmanship's leadership. The bill includes over $10 billion in new transportation and housing infrastructure without adding to the federal bureaucracy. The chairman fought for major funding for key areas of our economy, yes, including the Northeast. This is a major investment in our nation's infrastructure. Both Congress and the administration, as you know, have been talking about this for such a long time. Well, here you have it. In this bill delivers on that promise of infrastructure. Finally, the chairman has been a tireless advocate for 2 decades for housing for the disabled in our country. This bill delivers a major humanitarian victory for the disabled community with 40,000 new vouchers for the disabled. These Freeland-Heisen vouchers will change the lives of countless families across our entire nation. And I am particularly proud of this achievement by our chairman and his committee. Finally, I'd like to thank the Speaker of the House for standing up and winning on some huge priorities for the House. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the staff of the Appropriations Committee who worked long and hard, yes, very long and hard on this bill. Mr. Chairman, I urge a yes vote on this fine bill. I thank the chairman, and I yield back the remaining part of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Speaker, I ask to revise my remarks.
Without objection.
That's the House. Let me thank the gentlelady from New York. I can't thank her enough as I've watched her every day work without ending. Thank you so very much. And to Chairman Freeling, let me thank you as well for your service. But I am very grateful to Democrats who crafted the very funding structure that we're dealing with. And even though it was hidden with Republicans, this gigantic box that is almost broken, I think it is important to note that a lot of good work has taken place. And I want to just cite the good work. I am delighted that we are helping our veterans. And Democrats added an additional amount of money, some $2 billion to address the VA hospital. Democrats were concerned about student loans, and the bill increases it by $350 million. Child care has been increased. Houston Metro will be delighted with the new starts money that is in. And yes, my mayor will be excited, and other mayors, about an accurate census count. For those of us with Hurricane Harvey, the National Flood Insurance Program extension is important. But yet I am disappointed. The work we did on Stop School Violence did not include the civil rights protections for those who are needed. And it did not include DACA with all of these young people who are in need. And finally, we could not get the special counsel language, my bill 3684, that would stop the president from firing the special counsel and stop him from firing the attorney general and the deputy attorney general.
Gentlewoman is out of order.
For those reasons, I have great concerns with this bill
reserves.
and will not be able
Gentleman
to
from New Jersey
support
is
it. I yield back.
recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Military Construction Subcommittee, Mr. Dent from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased and I must say relieved to describe for my colleagues the good news in the Military Construction VA division of the omnibus. At times it seemed like we might not ever get here. I regret that our service members and veterans have had to wait almost 6 months for us to complete our jobs, but I think our final bill is worth the wait. I want to certainly congratulate our chairman, Mr. Freeling-Heisen, for his incredible patience and deft negotiating skill to bring us to this point. I also want to thank Mrs. Lowy and my comrade in arms, Ranking Member Debbie Wasserman Schultz, for her rock-solid support and keen analytic eye during this process. And thanks to the budget caps agreement, we're able to provide long overdue support to our military and their family members with a $2.4 billion or 31% increase for a total of $10.1 billion for military construction. With that funding, we're able to provide $708 million for 12 medical facilities, $249 million for DoD schools, and $8.2 billion for military construction projects in the United States.
Our members will appreciate that we're able to provide $585 million in unfunded requirements requested by the services, as well as significant increases in planning and design for active and reserve construction and unspecified minor construction. The bill also includes $750 million in OCO funding, more than doubling the 2017 level. Our bill fulfills Congress's commitment to our nation's veterans with total discretionary funding of $81.5 billion for the Department of Veterans Affairs, a $7.1 billion or 9.5% increase over 2017. These funds provide important medical services to veterans, as well as disability compensation, post-9/11 education benefits, and a host of insurance and lending programs. Of note, we were able to provide $782 million for the new electronic health record contract, the same record as DOD's, which will allow the exchange of veterans' health records with DOD and community providers. In addition, and consistent with the budget caps agreement, our bill provides $2 billion in medical infrastructure assistance, non-recurring maintenance, minor construction, and grants for state veterans' retirement homes. The $2 billion gives us the rare opportunity to completely eliminate the backlog of approved state home applications. I'm also pleased that that we have the resources. Mr. Can I just have the 30 seconds?
Additional time.
All right, gentleman's time is expired.
Support the bill. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Ohio, the ranking member of the Energy and Water Subcommittee.
Gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentlelady, the ranking member, for yielding me this precious minute, and I wanted to express to augment my remarks of earlier this afternoon and thank Jamie Shymick of our own staff, who worked so very, very hard on the Energy and Water Subcommittee, allowing this bill to move to the floor. And then I feel compelled to rise to thank our chairman of the full committee, Congressman Rodney Frelinghuysen, with whom I've had the opportunity to work now for many decades, and to say to him he is an exemplary model of public service to the people of our country, a true patriot, and someone who devoted so many hours to moving a bill to the floor that could achieve bipartisan consensus in a very loaded political environment. I shall never forget, at the beginning of the Iraq War, our trip to the Middle East, to many of the countries involved, the manner in which you comported yourself, the great counsel you gave to so many of us as a military man yourself, and the great leadership that he has provided as chair of our Defense Committee at one point and now of the full committee. The people of New Jersey can truly celebrate his service to our nation as we move this bill to a final vote later today. Thank you so very much, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman from Ohio yields back. Gentlewoman from New York, or New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I'm pleased to recognize the chairman of the Legislative Branch Subcommittee, Mr. Yoder of Kansas, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your work and leadership on this bill. Thank you to Ranking Member Lowy for her good stewardship. This is a culmination of efforts over the last year, hundreds of meetings, oversight hearings. We have a strong final product, and we're proud of what we've accomplished. In my committee's legislative branch bill, we focused on conservative priorities such as security, responsibility, and transparency. This legislation once again rejects pay increases for members of Congress, which we've done every year since 2010. And further, we're funding the House of Representatives remains 12% below 2010, 8 years, spending less than we spent 8 years ago. After the vicious attack on Steve Scalise and other members of this body, we have enhanced Capitol security with new support for members, staff, constituents, and visitors, with enhancements for Capitol Police and the Sergeant at Arms. We've expanded Wounded Warrior Fellowships, creating an additional 31 spots, and we've added support for family issues like the House Child Care Center, and additional support for the Library of Congress Visitor Experience, which is an exciting new product. Lastly, in a strike for transparency, for the first time, all Congressional Research Service reports will be open to the public, making government more transparency and a win for our constituents. I want to thank my ranking member, Mr. Ryan, who's a gentleman and a scholar, and the collaboration of all the committee members and staff that put this product together. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 30 seconds to a member of the committee, Jamie Herrera Butler from Washington State. We're good. I reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I'm pleased to yield a minute to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Wisconsin, the Speaker of the House, is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chair for yielding, and I want to begin by thanking the chairman, and I want to thank the ranking member. I also want to thank their staffs for putting in incredibly long hours. This isn't just a week-long progress. This has been months long in the making. So I want to thank all the members and staff who made this moment possible. My colleagues, this measure before us, it's about as critical as it gets. It really is. It addresses the priorities that we've been discussing in this chamber. We've been debating in this chamber for a long time. We talked about the need to rebuild our military. We all agree on the need to rebuild our military. This bill provides the largest increase in defense spending in 15 years. Why? Frankly, because our military has been hollowed out for many years. We're boosting resources for training, for equipment, for maintenance, for base operations. It means new naval ships, new fighters, new Apache and Black Hawk helicopters. It means we are finally building a 21st century fighting force. We agree on the need to support our service members and our veterans. This funds the biggest pay raise for our military in 8 years. We have men and women who are fighting for us day in, year out. I saw a woman, a lieutenant colonel, a week ago in the Army who has done 7 combat tours. This is what the people that are volunteering in our armed services are doing for us. And we're finally making right by them by helping them with the pay raise. It provides record funding for the Department of Veterans Affairs to make sure that our veterans receive better care at better facilities. Remember those long waiting lists? No more. This works on that. We agree on the urgent need to make our schools safer. This bill includes the Fix Nix bill to improve firearm and background checks. It includes the Stop School Violence Act, which this House passed just last week, I think 407 to 10, if I'm not mistaken. It provides funding for early intervention, mental health, school security programs. Both are provisions that the Parkland families asked Congress to include in this legislation. It's part of the Sandy Hook promise. We agree on the need to fight the opioid epidemic that is ravaging communities across this country. Every single member in this House has a firsthand story on what the opioid crisis is doing to their communities. We have got to get on top of this problem. This bill makes critical investments in treatment and in prevention to fight this scourge of addiction that is ravaging our country. We agree on the need to secure our homeland. This bill expands resources for law enforcement, for border security, for immigration enforcement. It provides resources for 95 miles of physical barriers along our southwest border, which actually exceeds the administration's request. We agree on the need to rebuild our nation's infrastructure. It includes funding for long overdue improvements to our highways, our railroads, our airports, our infrastructure. And guess what? There are no earmarks for specific projects in this bill. The House has worked to reform our forestry laws for years. You see on the news these horrible forest fires that are getting more severe by the year, and it is because we have not been able to manage our forests. This finally has the legislation we need to help manage our forests so we can help protect the West from these catastrophic forest fires. The House passed the Taylor Force Act to restrict assistance to the Palestinian Authority unless it stops subsidizing terrorism. This bill implements that legislation. And the PA is literally making payments to the families of suicide bombers. It's like a bonus for terrorism. That bill's in here. All of these things are important. They're critical things that we've all been talking about. What brings me here to ask all of my colleagues for a yes vote is this. What this ultimately is about is giving our military the tools and the resources it needs to do its job. This week, the House paused to honor 2 naval aviators who died in a training crash off of Key West, the 2 F-18 pilots. We paused to honor 7 service members lost in a helicopter crash in Western Iraq last week. That's 9 of our service members lost in equipment failures and accidents last week. We continue to lose more American personnel to training accidents and incidents than we do to enemy fire. That is unacceptable, and it's preventable. My colleagues, we should not wait one more day, not one more hour, to go by without giving our men and women in uniform what they have earned and what they deserve. Give them the pay raise that they earn. Give them the equipment and the hours of training that they need to be safe. They're putting their lives on the line for us. Let's make sure they put their lives on the line for us with the proper amount of training, with the proper amount of equipment, so that we can keep our country and our people safe. Vote yes for our military. Vote yes for the safety and the security of this country. Vote yes.
Gentleman from Wisconsin yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves.
Thank you.
Chair receives a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed with an amendment, H.R. 4851, an act to establish the Kennedy King National Commemorative Site in the state of Indiana and for other purposes in which concurrence of the House is requested.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time to close.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't the bill I would have written, but I am very proud that it provides $117 billion more than President Trump requested in non-defense investments to grow the economy, create jobs, and help American families. Again, I'd like to thank our distinguished chair, Chairman Frelinghuysen, and the entire committee for its tireless work forging this bipartisan package. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from New York yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, let me share my appreciation of my working relationship with Ms. Lowy. Thank again our very professional staff that's in the room here, and thank them for all their hard work, and urge a yes vote on this bill, which supports our armed forces and members of their family. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 796, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion by the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Frelinghuysen. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Speaker, I demand the ayes and nays.
The ayes and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the ayes and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the ayes and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on the motion to concur will be followed by 5-minute votes on motions to suspend the rules with regard to H.R. 4467 and H.R. 5089 and agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 255, the nays are 160.
Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no.
In this vote, the yeas are 256, the nays are 167. The motion is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4467 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4467, a bill to require the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize risk-based strategies and for other purposes.
The question